All right, friends, today I'm covering my Witchhunter. This is not a build guide because I'm not going to go that in depth, and I'll tell you why here in a second. But I will go over a lot of things I learned about the Witchhunter, the strengths, the weaknesses, how I feel about the Ascendancy, that sort of thing. Firstly, here is the mapping showcase of the build. The clear is honestly amazing. This was about 150 rarity in the video right now. It is one of my favorite builds I've ever played in Path of Exile. That being said, the reason why I'm not doing a build guide is because the single biggest problem with this build right now is its single target. Give a bit of leniency to it because it is a different state of the game than I was used to when I was playing my Sork. He has been fighting, max level bosses the entire time. And the other thing too is that he, in this current iteration, probably has like maybe 7 or 8 divines worth of gear in total on the character. And when I was playing my Sork, I mean, I bought shit that was probably worth like 20, 30 divine right now for like 200x, 250x. It was just a different game, and the market was just not so heinously dog shit back then. So I think those two things in combination, and my Sork didn't start off farming, max level bosses. I mean, I didn't even get my final last 2 boss points until like way later, until she was like 93 or something like that. And then on top of that too, like I wasn't hard juicing maps. Like this dude has only ran the hardest maps possible. I do not give him like any sort of white maps or anything like that. So while I do think that that plays a role in why the single target feels so bad, and it might not actually be as bad as I'm saying, I do think that even with that being said, it is still just rough as fuck. And you will, unless you're sitting on 50 div for a crossbow, bossing is probably not going to be an option for you. And so that's why this is more of a, I called it a build diary because I think it's cute and it's not a build guide. And again, I'm not trying to bait anyone. I don't want to sit here and tell you that this is like the greatest thing ever. It most certainly has problems, and I'm going to lay those out, and you can do with it whatever you will. That being said, I do think that the secret to fixing the single target problem is going to involve a weapon swap. I can't believe I actually have found a use for that system other than just cheesing Blink with the shield, but I think that weapon swapping to a bow will actually be kind of cracked for a single target. And with that lame shit out of the way, let's talk about the leveling experience. Overall, this character is actually pretty tanky with Catalysis, Cloak of Flame, and Blasphemy. I don't have Blasphemy on anymore, but you can just run Blasphemy and Feeble. Sorry, excuse me. You can run that as an aura, and it's like on average like 12% damage reduction from everything around you, which is pretty good. With that being said, though, I did spend like 10 exiles on gear before I started the campaign to be res capped the entire time, so take that with a grain of salt, and I also got some solid life pool out of it. And honestly, even given the defenses now, with just where it's sitting and only 1840 life, it is still pretty tanky in maps, and I have taken some hits that have blown me away that I still survive. Like the one idiots that like shoot their fucking hand at you and it goes super far and it becomes like a little point. I had one of those guys who was a rare hit me on a level 82 map with like 40% extra damage as cold, and he didn't kill me. Really close, like 98% of life, but the fact I survive is nuts. So you can take hits on this, some of course, and it is, I don't know, you just generally will survive pretty well, with the exception of probably the biggest problem in the game right now, which is fucking on death effects or things that persist after you kill the thing that fucking made it. I'm going to refrain from going off on this because I actually did that in an entirely separate video, which I'll be posting soon. But the point of it is that on-death effects are pretty much the only thing that's going to kill you. You will die occasionally to hits and stuff like that, but it's super rare. I mean, I died in the campaign like 5 times in total, and I've died an ass ton in the actual mapping, but literally 95% of it is to on-death effects. So aside from those, it's actually pretty tanky. It's not Storm River Tanker, and it never will be, of course, and it probably can't tank bosses either. I don't even attempt bosses on this character because the DPS is so bad. But aside from those things, it actually does survive maps pretty well, and I usually don't really even take damage in maps. When it came to the leveling setup I was running a Bleed Fizz Fragmentation Rounds build, and it was pretty solid for early game, but Bleed is just totally asymptotical with even scaling slightly. I stacked literally like all of these jewels were magnitude and deal damage faster for elements, whatever, as best I could. I had every single bleed wheel you could possibly fucking think of. And literally, the monster area goes up by 1 or 2 levels. You are free falling off the edge of a fucking cliff. It descales so fast. I genuinely have no idea how to get damage out of bleed. And maybe I did it wrong. I'm sure I did. But as of right now, for just a basic approach, it is not great. The main reason I even went bleed was because I wanted to spec into lifesteal, and in order to go lifesteal heavy, you have to deal all fizz damage because that's what the leech comes from. And it feels good, actually. I do like leech when you have it up and running, but it's just so much of an investment. It's so much of an investment to get off the ground when you could just not spend the 20 points or whatever the fuck it is and just press your potion button. Because when you stack all this lifesteal, you just never use your potion ever. I mean, I was actually using Val Pack, which I do think is pretty solid, but you definitely need to like a higher amount of hits going out. It's not like a fragmentation round, super slow as fuck shooting thing. And not only could you replace all these points with the potion, you could also just run cannibalism on a single aura anywhere. Cannibalism is insane. Percent life recovered on kill feels so good in this game, and I actually think in order to solve my mana problems while mapping, I'm just going to throw 2% mana on kill on one of these jewels randomly, because it just solves so many problems and it feels great. I'm not gonna lie, like it is really, really nice to have the percent resource on kill. But ultimately is because I wanted to lifesteal that I went so much fizz, and then that's why I took bleed to, you know, because it's the element of fizz or whatever. Overall is a bad call. If I could run it back, and when I do run it back after a wipe or something, I will 100% take galvanic shards. The reason for this being is that one of the problems that you run into in this Ascendancy, particularly with like frag rounds, actually, if you're trying to do what I was doing, is that because Culling Strike applies before the hit, so it checks to see if it's at the culling threshold, and no matter what damage you deal, if it's not at the culling threshold, you'll have to hit it again. This is a really annoying problem to solve, and Galvanic Shards actually solves it innately because it causes lightning beams to chain between targets when you hit them. That gives you that secondary hit that you need to have the culling effect to kill everything. This is really nice because, especially with frag rounds firing speed and how slow it is, it also has the other problem that the spread on it is just honestly terrible. It's like a very, very small cone, whereas Galvanic Shards has so much area coverage, it feels like, comparatively, that you just have way better clearing. And then a bit later on in the campaign, once you get Zealous Inquisition and Pitiless Killer, always get this one first, of course, you start to notice that you will just obliterate groups of mobs relatively easy because of the mechanical nature of Galvanic Shards and that secondary hit that it applies. This becomes even better later down the line once you are 56 and you can equip this helmet to get 100% increased Culling Strike threshold. This is really nice for clearing, especially if you don't have a whole lot of damage or you're starting early on, because all of this is health based. And then on top of that, even further down the line, once you get to maps and you're able to finally do your third Ascendancy, Decimating Strike adds into all of this, and eventually you're just kind of wiping whole groups of mobs for free without even really, all you have to do is hit them. You just need to hit them a little bit, because you just need to get, you know, theoretically you get the 30% or whatever, and then you just need to get 10% more to bring a white mob to the culling threshold, and then hopefully you get Zealous Inquisition proccing, and yeah, it just results in a lot of really free clear early on with very little investment. And don't get me wrong, I adore the Witchhunter Ascendancy. It feels great early on, but it does have a few problems. Firstly, I think Zealous Inquisition, I wish these numbers were flipped. I wish it was a 100% chance for 10% of their max life. I think that would feel so much better, because right now this is like pretty few and far between. It's a little too sparse to really enjoy. On top of that, having a basic Culling Strike is just kind of boring, especially when you can slot this in as a support to one of your random abilities if you need to cull things. Also, cull is just relatively available across the board for a lot of different classes and different skills. I don't think this is really interesting for an Ascendancy. And I think the way I would change this is I would just give them a better Culling Strike that applies after the hit. I think that change alone would make this feel incredible, and it would be like a huge buff to the Ascendancy from a feel perspective. But overall, combining the Ascendancy itself with the use of crossbows, it kind of just feels like we are a worse ranger in pretty much every way. This Ascendancy is more or less just a band-aid for not having damage early on, and later on, when you actually start to fight real mobs, all these band-aids fall off, and it feels pretty terrible. Even if you get a good roll on Decimating Strike, all of this just kind of goes away, and all you have is No Mercy. You just get 30% more damage on the boss, and that in combination with crossbows, I don't know what it is about crossbows. I understand that they have higher fizz ranges than bows or whatever, and that's kind of the offset, but the fact that you have to reload, on top of the fact that they just don't really have like a whole lot of skills going for them that combo well, and maybe that isn't true. I know on this build, I've experimented with all this stuff, and it just doesn't even feel that great. Whereas if you look at something like bow, the fact that you have lightning arrow, and then you can lightning rod, and then magnetic salvo, and that sort of thing, all that stuff seems like it's just way better for comboing than it is the things that you have for a crossbow. And don't get me wrong, it obviously feels incredible for mapping and clearing and that sort of thing, but it just really comes down to the problems of single target. I think that that's where Ranger kind of shines in comparison, is because Lightning Arrow already has pretty good clear just in general. They can do a lot of good things, but also from their Ascendancy, they just get way more utility that we get. And then because they have combos, they can just damage scale on the single target, and they don't actually need any of this, because all this can be replaced. Like if I could lightning salvo and or lightning rod and magnetic salvo or whatever and do like a bunch of cool combos and get, you know, the 200% more damage on my single target or whatever, you wouldn't actually need any of this, nor would you care. And in the case of Ranger, all of this stuff gets replaced in that stage of the game by a bunch of really good utility and like an extra proj and that sort of thing. And I know I mentioned this earlier, but honestly, reloading is kind of rough. On top of not having a quiver, I understand we get higher physical DPS values on crossbows, but the reload can really honestly screw you sometimes. The other thing too is that sometimes it's actually better to slot a gem socket to deal with reloading than it is to not. So I think that you actually have a lot of investment to get crossbows feeling good, whereas that just more or less doesn't exist on the bow, despite the fact that crossbows have a higher top end DPS. And I'll be honest with you, there are some moments where I'm reloading and my butthole is clenched for what feels like an hour, because he's just sitting there fucking with his crossbow and he will not reload it, and it drives me insane. Don't get me wrong though, I still love this build. Overall, it just doesn't really feel like there's a lot of room to work with in regards to like the Ascendancy plus crossbows. But I do think that this is where weapon swapping actually comes in. And I think that if I weapon swap to a bow to get my single target out, I actually think this build will be cracked as fuck. So once I get to that point, I will probably do a build guide at then, assuming I can get it off the ground. Well, with all that said and done out of the way, let's move on to the actual dope part of the build, which is the triple Herald. So I watched Fubgun's video a few days ago where he talks about how Herald chaining effects are incredible, and they are amazing. And he talked about the criteria required to make them chain. Ultimately, it comes down to having enough damage for Herald of Ice to inflict shock and Herald of Thunder to freeze things. Once they're able to inflict the opposing ailment of Herald of Thunder freezing things and Herald of Ice shocking things, that's how you get that infinite chain that you see in the video, and that's what Fubgun talks about as well. And I'll link his video in the description. It's pretty cool to watch, and it's a really interesting interaction. And it was what this build was based off of, particularly when it came to kind of trying to figure out how to get clear out of it. As Fubgun points out in his video, the general gating requirement to getting this off the ground is that you need a ton of damage. The way that ailments are inflicted is that the magnitude of the hit increases the chance of shock applying, and the magnitude of the cold damage increases how much freeze you actually apply. So you really need to get a ton of damage off the ground to get this chaining effect to actually work. So what people do is they take an Against the Darkness that gives them 4% of damage as cold and 4% of damage as lightning on notable passive skills. As you can see, I don't have that because that jewel is literally like 100 fucking divines. And that jewel with his setup gives him 28% of damage as cold and 28% damage as lightning, which are the opposing elements for Herald of Thunder and Herald of Ice. And then he runs lightning infusion on Herald of Ice and cold infusion on Herald of Thunder. And ultimately he gets enough of an actual hit of the element required to apply the opposing ailment that's how the chain begins. Now, of course, who the fuck has 100 divine for this bullshit? While I don't know who does, I can tell you who most certainly does it, and it's fucking me. So, the way we get around this extreme expense is by going with an Against the Darkness that gives us fire damage, and if you haggle with people, this is like 1.5 div. And I can hear you guys speaking to me right now. Riley, I hear you say, fire sucks ass, we don't give a fuck about Ignite. How does this help us achieve anything that you just talked about? Well, dear viewer, you are correct. However, we have a fix for this. To get around the problem of fire being absolutely bumfuck useless, we use this helmet, the Three Dragons. This helmet conveniently, and it only works because it converts cold to ignite. If it converted cold to something else, we would not be able to run this super jank budget setup. But because it converts fire damage to shock chance and lightning damage to freeze, this just so happens to perfectly align with our goal. Firstly, what this does is it immediately allows Herald of Thunder to start freezing things because it deals lightning damage. So you actually don't need to slot anything on it. You just throw Glaciation on this thing. And then with Glaciation, I also throw in Ice Bite. And this just gives you a 35% of damage as cold the entire time while you're mapping, because this will freeze pretty much every single time. And then, because it converts fire damage to shock chance, all we need is an Against the Darkness that gives us 4% of fire damage, and this is astronomically cheaper. Now, What we do then is on Herald of Ice, we slot Fire Infusion, but there's a little bit more to this. With 3 dragons and Against the Darkness with some extra fire damage, we're starting to cook with some gas, but we need a little bit more. So one of the things I add to this is a bunch of ailment infliction. So I take this right here, I have this node right here, which is all freeze and shock buildup. I also take this anointment right here for shock, because getting the Herald of Ice to shock is actually the hardest part of this. And I will go over the other fix that I have for this, which is using Herald of Ash. That being said, someone asked in one of my comments, is there a better anointment? I do think this one is really good, but I actually think that if you have the money for it, Volcanic Skin is probably the better one since it's 3% extra. The only problem with Volcanic Skin is that it's literally like 7 divine. This is an unbelievably expensive anointment, and I think this amulet was literally like 40x or something. This amulet is cheap as balls, so I just can't justify it. But I think if I had like a really GG amulet, then I would probably go this one. But anyways, once we get a bunch of extra ailment application, and I have it on my jewels as well, it's pretty much everywhere, we have everything that we need to get the ailment off the ground. However, one of the problems is even with all of this, Herald of Ice still just doesn't like to shock as much as I would like it, even with Fire Infusion. To get around this problem, the last piece of the puzzle is Herald of Ash. Now, let me state this right now. What I'm about to say for how these heralds interact with each other is I do not understand how this works, and this is pure conjecture. It might be totally wrong on how this interaction is functioning, but that being said, regardless of how I understand it, the moment you turn on Herald of Ash, it seems to work instantly. So I assume it works how I'm going to say it is, but again, I don't actually know, so take it with a grain of salt. I could be wrong. But the point of Herald of Ash is that once we quality it a little bit, you only need 10%. It ignites surrounding enemies if overkill damage is at least 1% of the enemy's health. And because we have Culling Strike and everything else going on, we of course are always doing that. So what theoretically is happening when I think of this interaction is that all of the Herald effects essentially occur simultaneously. It was what it feels like. So something gets hit and it explodes and ignites everything around it. Meaning that on Herald of Ice, to get more fire damage, we can apply Immolate. Supported attacks gain 30% of damage as extra fire against ignited enemies. Now, on top of having Fire Infusion, we're gaining 30% additional damage as fire damage, and then on top of that, we add in Conduction, and this gives us way more shock chance on Herald of Ice, and it ultimately solves our problem for shocking. Also, I throw in Innervate because you just get another 35% of damage as lightning. This has pretty much 100% uptime. And this is how I gauged if Herald of Ash was actually working, by the way. If I turn this off and run a map with Innervate on, I don't see the buff near as often. But the moment this is on, it's pretty much on 100% of the time. So I'm assuming what happens is that all the ailments are checked against each other, and when Herald of Ice explodes and Herald of Ash explodes at the same time, Herald of Ash is checked against a shocked target, and Herald of Ice is checked against an ignited target, I think. Again, don't totally know how that works, but either way, once you turn this on, this interaction becomes incredible, and you just shock everything, and you don't actually need to worry about getting the insane Mirror Turbo and all the other bullshit in the 100 Divine Jewel. And finally, because we have all these Heralds active, we actually get some pretty cool passives. So this one right here is just crazy, because we always have this active because we have all 3 heralds on. And then of course we take these herald nodes right here because we just get the extra 4% of damage as extra fire damage. Ultimately, I think this build works really well for clearing. In fact, I think it's amazing for clearing, and I prefer it way over my Stormweaver. But I do think there are a few other problems that I'm encountering. First and foremost is going to be the stat stacking problem. So I don't want to stat stack on this character because obviously we know like stat stacking is good. Like, of course, just throw the gloves on, give the staff or whatever, however you want to do it, and just stack stats and your character will pop off. I'm trying to avoid that, but in doing so, it's kind of one of the big problems of Witchhunter is that everything just requires dual stats. Like, you need so much. Herald of Ice, if you want to upgrade this, or I'm sorry, Herald of Thunder is 133 dexterity at level 14. It's like 191 at level 20. Herald of Ice requires 97 int, and then Galvanic Shards has an equivalent strength and dex requirement. So this character, literally by definition, I guess it's stupid. I'm really just doing it because I don't want to go down the stat stacking road. But by definition, this character is like a tri-stat stacker no matter what. And I'll point out here as well, thank God 3 Dragons has as much all res as it does. Otherwise, I actually don't think I would ever be able to solve my stat problems. Eventually, I'll be able to replace this ring and this amulet and get some better stats on it to get rid of this stuff and kind of kill off some of these travel nodes that I have. Like, I would like to get rid of these. But overall, yeah, just solving for stats on a Witch Hunter is actually kind of brutal. And I'll be honest with you guys, I'm actually not that big of a fan of this tree and how it sits right now. A lot of it is just band-aids for not having damage. This right here, this is just to get extra fire. This is not too bad actually. But like these jewels, a lot of these jewels are just for magnitude effect. This actually is a pretty good wheel. I thought this wheel was kind of a meme, but the honest truth is that we don't really have a whole lot of pen. Well, we don't have a way to cap pen, I should say. You actually get quite a bit from this tree down here, and you get some right here as well. This kind of rounds it out. I think it's like 84% in total. So this is pretty good. But I do think once I can fix the stat problems, once I can blow 80 div on a crossbow after my Mirror of Calandra drops, fingers crossed, I should be able to make this build not suck ass, but we'll see. Real quick, just to go over my gear, of course, we have the 3 dragons, and then we have Cloak of Flame. I really like Cloak of Flame. What's nice about this is that this corruption with 3 sockets is 4x. So you get 40% of fizz damage taken as fire, which is absolutely cracked. And then on top of that, this gives you like 92 to total elemental resistances, which is really good for a slot. Because between these two things, we absolutely need all the open suffixes we can get on gear to fix our res problems. And again, you get chaos res, and of course you have to have rarity on absolutely everything because that's just the game. We love Magic Find, it's really great. I do run Rizlatha's Coil. This is because this gives you quite a bit of damage, and just from the nature of how these things work, all of this elemental damage is just pulled from a percentage of fizz damage dealt by your weapon. So if I get more maximum physical attack damage right here, and then 40% of that damage is taken as lightning damage for galvanic shards, if we just increase the fizz damage, it increases the damage for galvanic shards. That's why this does this. Also, what's really OP about this belt is how it works with lightning rod. Lightning damage with non-critical hits is lucky. This means that the range on galvanic shards for my lightning damage, it's 81 to 72. So if the first time I hit a mob, it rolls like, 82, and then the second time it rolls 700, because it's lucky, it'll always roll it twice and it'll take the higher of the 2 rolls. So this is a huge damage boost and is an incredible node. Like this right here, the fact that this is in range of the jewel, plus it gives me lucky hits on non-critical, this is absolutely cracked as fuck. So that's why I run Rizlatha's Coil. I don't know if I'm going to keep this forever. This might have to go. But I do think between these 2 uniques, I actually have enough to solve for all my stats and suffixes. To cap it all off, while this build most certainly has its issues, no doubt for my lack of understanding, and the only reason I'm progressing with it is because I have a Stormweaver just sitting AFK in the back that I can swap to at any point in time, I do absolutely adore this build, and it is one of my most favorite PoE builds in PoE 1 or 2 that I have ever played. Hopefully, this video gave you guys some ideas, and honestly, feel free to give me some ideas. I am not opposed, nor am I ashamed of taking help for things I don't understand. But regardless, the Stormweaver guide is on the way out. I actually have one more video coming out. It'll be a super quick one. I'll probably actually finish it tonight and post it a day from now. But on that, I'll see you guys then. Deuces.